Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chat. Thanks for joining me again for these wonderful respites from my research. Today was a perfect example. My eyes are going a little nuts. I'm actually working on a project that is trying to track down a lot of minute details. So it's a good break to have in the afternoon as I do that. And the wind's howling outside, and the sun keeps coming in and out. But hopefully, spring is coming soon. A few of you have asked about just a little housekeeping before we get started on the topic today. A few people have asked about whether these talks are available on a podcast or something similar. I am going to work on it because you've asked for that, a couple people at least. Um, but this wasn't, I didn't want to put too much effort into this live stream if people weren't going to watch. And so I think enough people are watching to make it worthwhile, maybe expand a little bit. So I promise, check on that. And great, that's a great suggestion. And again, you don't need to be seeing my face. You can just listen to me. So hopefully I can figure that out. But again, thanks for the support of this. This is a lot of fun for me, and I hope we're getting a few that it's worthwhile for you to be listening. Because sometimes when I write, writing is a little more constraining, and so it's great to just be able to chat about a topic. And so I find this a great extension of what I'm writing about. And I've learned to be one of the lessons I've learned from this is that everything doesn't need to be perfect. When you're writing something, you're fact checking every minute detail and making sure everything sounds right. And of course, I want to make sure what I say here is true, whether I write it or say it. But this just seems a little more free form, and the feedback is great too. So, which I don't always get immediately anyway when I'm writing. So that's wonderful. If you like what you are seeing here, feel free to share. And if you're not liking or following this page in order to get the notifications of what we're going to talk about, things like that, please do so and tell other people who might be interested. Um, a couple weeks ago, we talked about earthquakes, and we got this topic that I had planned for that week was postponed because I thought it would be more interesting to talk about something that was more timely, which was the earthquake that had occurred the day before. And a lesson I had learned about trying to talk about something that I was halfway through in researching. I didn't have all my facts straight, and I got kind of confused when I was talking about the earthquakes. And I hopefully, if you watched and you didn't read the comments that I put in the earthquake discussion, um, please do so, because after I was talking on this Tuesday afternoon, after I had done about half the research that I had wanted to do, and after the fact I had found out a whole lot more. So that was one of the lessons that I had learned, that maybe not talk about something that I was halfway through. But everybody was talking about the earthquake, so I thought it'd be fun to talk about it on that particular week. The topic we're talking about today is one that was similarly comes from you and comes from people who visit the historian's office or call about the historian's office, called the historian's office about a particular topic. And we have a couple things in town that seem to be asked about a lot more than other things. Like there's about like the top five things that are asked about. And the mile covered racetrack, and I'm going to call it the indoor racetrack, and we'll talk about that in a bit as to why there's a distinction there. Um, it was over on the Jewett farm over on Grover Road, and it's asked about all the time. And I get asked, where was it? And when was it? And why did we have it? And so I figured it'd be a good topic to talk about today. A couple weeks ago, I put it out as a topic, and it's so funny because the second I put it out there, um, and then had to backtrack and then bring it out today, I've been asked again, or I've seen actually Joe Stapleton posted on the East Auroran history groups, East Aurora history Facebook groups, an article about the racetrack just the other day. And then I got some students are working on a project, and a couple days ago, actually it was last week, I got asked about the racetrack again. So I thought, well, how timely is that? So I didn't do this on purpose today, but maybe this conversation can help answer some of the questions that we're still getting about this. One of the most fascinating parts of our history in East Aurora. But when it really needs to start earlier, and why did we get this indoor racetrack? Um, well, beginning in the mid 1800s, a man named Cicero Hamlin, and you may have heard his name. Um, he started off as a merchant, but then he started what was known as the Village Farm here in East Aurora, and it was located where Hamlin Avenue and North Willow Street are today, up toward the west end. And it was a world famous horse breeding farm. He bred horses, and you might have heard of Bambrino King. We've talked about him before, and I've written about him before, but um, he is not associated with the covered racetrack that has become world famous. But he is probably part of a big part of the reason why it's here, because Mr. Hamlin had his farm, his breeding farm there. Um, the Jewetts, there were two brothers. The Jewetts started their farm, a competing farm, so to speak, even though there was plenty of room for everybody, out on Grover Road at the corner of Grover and Route 28, what is Route 28 today. And they had big plans, and there's a whole story with them. The brothers actually split, and Henry Jewett actually ended up taking over the farm himself. But they had big plans. In addition to horses and breeding horses and racing horses, they had this idea of a mineral springs where people could come, and similar to Saratoga Springs. And actually, they had this idea that East Aurora could be like Saratoga Springs, which is, for those who don't know, a village out in the eastern part of New York State near Albany, that had, mineral springs, and then they have horse racetracks even to today. And people from the big cities, well-off people, would come to East Aurora in this case, and stay at a hotel. Race the horses, or the rich horse owners would come here to East Aurora with their horses. Um, and it would be very similar if people ask about what the vision was, and I said, look at Saratoga Springs. That's what East Aurora, the Jewetts were hoping that East Aurora would end up being. So they had this grand plan for a hotel, the Narenta Springs Hotel. They actually bottled mineral spring water because there were mineral springs up on the hill that they had discovered, and they were going to have this grand hotel. Well, the hotel never happened, but they did have a horse training facility and a horse racing facility. So they built these barns, and then eventually Henry Jewett built racetracks. And the problem is up here in the north, as you know, in the middle of winter time, there's snow and it's cold and it's very difficult to have horse races in snow. So he had this, or to even train horses in snow. So what he did is he had this idea that he was going to enclose at least a portion of the racetrack that was there. So one of the myths that is out there about this racetrack is that Henry Jewett had this plan to have a mile-long covered racetrack, and he knew that it was going to be this very unique thing, and that he was going to promote it, and it was going to be this. That was his plan from the beginning, and it was not. Actually, going back into the records, I wrote about this back in 2017 because it was the 100th anniversary of the track being dismantled. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit, because there's a lot of myths regarding that as well. Legends, actually. Some of them are true. But he had this, the myth out there is that he had this grand plan to have this mile covered racetrack to compete with Hamlin and to attract people, especially the wealthy horse owners, to his farm. Well, he started off not with a mile long. The advertiser, if you dig back into the Easter Advertiser archives, and some of the dates are wrong. They said that the racetrack was built in the 1880s. Actually, into the 1870s, there were some reports. He actually bought the land in 1878, and then later. There were some sources that said 1885, but the first mention of it, actually, if you go to the primary sources in the Advertiser, is the 1890. Josiah, his brother, Henry, had left the business, and Henry was building a cover, and they called it an immense cover over his one of the racetracks. Um, and so one of the some history books have said that he built this mile-long track all at once. Well, in fact, the track was already there, and he was just covering it as a way to beat the winter snow. And he did it in stages. So it wasn't this grand plan to have a mile-long racetrack. And actually, he started off doing a quarter mile. So the track would actually be partially underground, or under cover, not underground, undercover. And the covered part was going to be just a fraction of the track. So he'd at least have some of it done. Well, they were building it, um, they were able to do a half mile. And then less than a year later, of course, seemed probably successful, and he was able to number one, have the resources, and it seemed to be working out really well. So he actually went to 3/4 of a mile, and then a few years after that, he enclosed the entire mile. So the racetrack was in stages. So he didn't plan necessarily to have a mile-long full loop racetrack undercover. It just worked out that way he realized, and this was probably a smart move, that this was a unique idea. He was going to enclose a racetrack, that if it didn't work out, he didn't want to, build the whole thing at once. Plus, he probably, this was a big deal, so he probably didn't want to do it all at once. He probably didn't have the resources to do it all at once either. So this mile track, and just picture what a mile is. So the old, there's a quarter-mile track at Hamlin Park that people run around. Now that's the original one. They've since extended it. I think it's a half mile. But so four of those that go around the baseball diamond, that used to go around the baseball diamond in Hamlin Park, that's a pretty big. A mile is oval is pretty big. Um, and to have it enclosed now, so it's often referred to as a covered racetrack. Well, to me, that means just a roof. This was actually an indoor racetrack, and there were walls on the side, and there were windows all the way around it. So quite impressive, and those windows are going to be important later in the story. So it was an indoor racetrack. Within the inside of it was another racetrack inside that was an outdoor racetrack. So you had this covered racetrack, and then you had this other outdoor racetrack inside. Why was this important? Well, so he builds this track, but they were connected to the stables, and they were connected to the barns. So these rich, well, let's be honest, they were very wealthy people who horse racing is a very expensive hobby and business. So these people who owned champion racehorses, and they weren't just your millionaires who had horses as a hobby. These were actually money-making champion racehorses that they needed to be trained, and it was a big business. So what was Henry Jewett offering? Well, he was offering you a place to stable the horses and to train. And because the track was connected, and I'm going to post in a bit after those of you who aren't watching live will be able to see it. The images, and just we concentrate so much on the track, but look at how it's connected to the barns. So you could take the horse from inside a barn right into the track. And this was hugely important in the winter. So you could have these horse owners could bring their horses here and train them, essentially trying to recreate an outdoor atmosphere without having to take them down south, which was more expensive. So it just was a very unique way to attract uh, the horse owners to East Aurora, to a place that otherwise we would lose out in the wintertime. There's no way that we would be having races in the middle of winter, January, February. So this was an indoor racetrack. We don't have that many pictures of it. Again, I'll post some of the pictures that we do have. We have drawings of it. There is a particular picture that shows the actual track from a newspaper, but it's still an actual picture that shows. What's remarkable about that is it shows all the windows that were on it, and just how big it was, how massive it was. And then there's also an interior picture that gives you just the idea that it really was indoor. This became a tourist attraction. People, they would actually have excursions from the Roycroft Inn. You'd stay at the Roycroft Inn, and then they'd have like a shuttle that would take you out to the racetrack. There'd be races, so they would advertise this in the local newspaper. The Easter Advertiser would, tell you which horses were racing over at the track in the middle of wintertime. So it gave this form of entertainment that we wouldn't have had otherwise in the middle of winter. So it was a huge attraction. Um, they billed it as, they advertised it as the world's only covered mile-long racetrack. And it probably was, the distinction was there were other racetracks that had covers on them, but that it was completely covered, completely enclosed. So that's what made it unique. It probably garnered more fame after the fact. Later on, it was part of, there was a, you probably know that we all know the TV show Ripley's Believe It or Not, but there was actually a newspaper column, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and it was a syndicated newspaper column, and it was actually included as part of that. So that's how big of a deal it was. Um, so it did have legendary status, which of course lends itself to great, as we talked about before, myths and legends. The bigger something is, and the more legendary it becomes, the more myths and legends there are about it. But uh, one of the things that I get asked a lot about, and we'll talk about a myth in a second, but one of the things I get asked a lot is where was it? And what's great about this track was that you can tell where it was. So this was torn down. Henry Jewett actually had some problems with the horse industry. He claimed a few years after he built the covered track, he was concerned about corruption, and he just wanted to get out of actually being involved in racing horses. But he continued to rent stables there. So he made a lot of money renting the stables in the middle of winter and allowing trainers to come up here and simulate the racing conditions in this indoor track. So he partly probably was so busy doing that, in addition to the fact that he had some issues, he said, at least publicly, he had issues with the corruption and things that were going on in the horse racing industry. But he probably was, this unique idea of having a covered track and barns and things that he could just rent out to other people who owned horses, and he could stay out of the actual racehorsing business. He was just a renter, a landlord offering this service for people who actually owned the horses. By 1917, so this happened in the 1890s, so this actually, the racetrack wasn't around very, very long, and it was never really meant to last very long. I don't think he built it to last forever. But by the 1910s, and so by 1917, and you have to remember at that point as well, we were entering World War I, and there were other elements happening. But the horse racing industry had changed, and he essentially lost business. People weren't as attracted to coming to East Aurora, and the money was drying up, essentially. So he decided, little by little, the track was being used less and less, and by 1917, he decided to close it. And one of the myths and legends around the covered racetrack is that the windows from the track are in people's houses around East Aurora. And at first, when I heard that, I'm like, I'm very skeptical of claims like that, and people will point out a window in their house, or a series of windows would be like, or they have a barn and it has windows in it, and they said, well, those windows came from the Jewett covered racetrack. Well, not to say that every single claim like that is true, but the fact that the windows and even the lumber from the racetrack, when it was dismantled in 1917, that is true. So actually, Henry Jewett put an advertisement in the Easter Advertiser. Again, I will put that in the comments of our discussion today. The advertisement said that before he had given a contract to a Buffalo company to come dismantle the track and take it to Buffalo. Take all the materials, the windows, the lumber, everything. But before that, he made it available to sale to local people. So you could go to the old Jewett farm at the corner of Grover and Route 20A and go buy windows and the lumber from this old track. Um, Perhaps people were nostalgic and wanted a piece of that history, but probably they were good windows. And there were, remember, there's a mile-long racetrack that had windows on both sides all the way around. So there were a lot of windows, and so people came and purchased them. So we have proof that that is true. So that story has been told, down the line. But going back into the Easter Advertiser and other newspapers, they actually advertised that these were for sale in 1917. So we know that people went up to the farm and bought the windows and the lumber from the track. Now, everybody that claims that they have windows, that may not be true, but we do know that it did happen. So, you can take a look at the pictures of the mile-long track and kind of see if the windows match up to the claims today that the windows were part of that. But that if someone does claim that, or if you believe that, someone's told that to you about your house, previous owners often do that, it could possibly be true because they did sell those windows. Where was this track? Well, if you look at an aerial view on Google Earth, and you just put into the Google search the corner of Route 28, Quaker Road, and Grover Road, and it would be the southwest corner of that. And there are houses along Grover Road, and there are houses and other buildings along Route 20A. And there's this big open area um, behind those houses. So if you're going down Route 20A as you are driving out toward Orchard Park, you pass Grover Road, and you look to the left, and there's a bright red barn-looking building. Behind that is where this track was. But on the Google Earth, you can pretty much see where it was. Not much has been added there. So the land there, you can really picture where it is. Of course, there's maps that show where it was. The 1909 Atlas is a perfect example that tells us where it was. And it's quite fascinating. If you overlay the 1909 map on a modern satellite view, you can see it just seems natural where it was. So take a look at that if you want to kind of see where this track was. Um, the last remnant, really, of this track, where there were two parts of it. One, in the 1960s, I believe it was, they were reconfiguring. The state was Department of Transportation was reconfiguring Quaker Road, and they needed fill for it. So they took the old fill from the track, that land there, and used it. So it was nearby, they could use it, and when they had the track, of course, it was leveled out and there was fill, so they used that later on. Um, there was the barn, they called it, on Grover Road, which was a barn that was connected to this racetrack, and that lasted to 1980. And it turned into a barn. Well, it was a barn, and then it turned into a bar. Got confused between barn and bar. It became a bar, and they called it the Barn. And actually, for a while, it was known as the Function Junction Bar. And it had a reputation of its own, aside from its connection to the mile-covered racetrack and the Jewetts. There were floor shows there. There were dancers, and a couple years in there. There are lots of stories that I hear. Even my own family members back then would go to the barn. There's even a picture of my grandfather having a beverage at the barn. And for some, when people say, when you want to know what the reputation of this place was, you need to ask when, because it had different owners and different reputations throughout the years. But they advertised scantily clad women dancing in floor shows at the barn. This was advertised right in the Easter Advertiser, so it's not even part of local legend. So when someone talks about the dancers at the barn, it's true. it's not just part of local legend. It was actually printed in ads. They advertised their floor shows right in the ads in the East Aurora Advertiser and other publications. Um, and so this was a local, bar that people went to, and then it burned in 1980. So this old part of East Aurora's history, a lot of people didn't know its connection to the Jewett farm. When you talk about the barn on Grover Road, they may remember it as the bar that was there, with a reputation all of its own. So that was probably the last piece. There are other elements of the Jewett farm along there. There are houses that belonged, but as connected to that mile-long racetrack, that's probably the last remnant of it. But again, look at the aerial views, and it's interesting just to look at that corner of Grover and Route 20A, and you can, without even telling you, you can definitely tell where it was, because there's a big open space to this day right there. Um, so that I believe is the only there a lot of what's great about this, and not to get off track, what's great about this topic is that sometimes we have myths and legends, and a lot of times when I tell a story, I get to debunk a lot of the legends that are out there. But in this case, a lot of the stories that are told about the Ripley's Believe It or Not, so to speak, you can believe it. The windows were sold, and they are included in a lot of houses and barns in the East Aurora area. Um, and even though a lot of people believe that the mile-long track was covered all at once, and that was Henry Jewett's intention, um, it it did exist. And so I think a lot of people think it's a part of a legend, that this facility existed. Um, One of the things that is interesting about this particular facility was that, how big of a deal it was. And I think today we talk about a mile covered racetrack, um, and we have stadiums with fully domed stadiums. We may not be getting one in Orchard Park, but um, huge athletic facilities. But for its time, that was a huge big deal. The late 1800s, to have an enclosed racetrack was a really, really big deal. And so that's why it garnered all the attention that it did. So that's the covered racetrack. The indoor racetrack, you'll hear it said covered, but I prefer to use the word indoor because I think that's a little more accurate description of what it was. So again, I'll post all these wonderful things I've talked about, the photos, and the drawings, and I'll also put up the article that I wrote back in 2017. And I wrote it at that time because it was the 100th anniversary of when it was torn down. And so there's a lot more detail in that about how many windows and how many shingles on the roof. They really described it quite detailed in the East Aurora Advertiser. So I'll add that on there. And again, if you have any questions about anything, I really like getting ideas from y'all. Actually, there are students at the high school taking a local history class, and they have great ideas. A teacher there is sharing ideas or just what people are interested in. Again, I sometimes feel like I'm working in a bubble, so it's great to hear what people are thinking. Things, because I'm involved with history all the time, I don't always know what's going to be of interest. What's great about this Facebook chat is I can look back and see what topics are more popular, because Facebook tells me how many of you are watching and for how long. So I can tell immediately how well a certain topic is doing. And so that gives me great feedback as well. But another topic that folks ask a lot about is how to research the history of their house. And someone actually asked me that the other day, and I just referred them. I have something written about it, but I did a video back. One of our earliest videos was about that topic. Just referred them to that. And so feel free to go back and look through the topics that we've done before and see if anything's of interest, and especially the one about researching your house. I still get lots of questions about that, and it's a lot of fun to do, and there's a lot of neat ways, not just not just property records. There's a lot of things you can do to research the history of your house. So go back and look at those videos and share if you like. I appreciate that. And again, keep the ideas coming. And I appreciate you joining us every week. And until next week, we'll wish you a happy, happy President's Day week. And hopefully we make it through this alleged ice storm tomorrow. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.